We're now entering day 12 or 13 of this experiment that I've been running, which is, can you use an AI agent to code non trivial software? From a person who has been doing this for like 23 years, who's always been like a manual coder. I've never really used AI tools before. And a lot of people are saying a lot of things, but you never know until you try. Right? Like a lot of people on social media be like, well, I make it to code apps all the time. And it's like, yeah, but like, what kind of app are you coding, and like how complicated is it, and how rigorous is it, and is it like production ready code? Like what level of code are we talking about here? Because and this is going to be one thing that I have observed on this project. I've used Claude to make some both they're interesting but trivial applications. I'll show you some output here, but what I've essentially done is use Claude to create a small C program that parses the output of LS and then presents it in like a pretty zebra stripe table. And that is definitely a cool thing to do. It didn't take Claude very long to do it. Kind of got it the first go. Really nice. I was able to open the code, edit it to change some colors and change some settings. But for the most part, it worked really good. And then I also used Claude to make a little significant lines of code counter. I do think that there's actually a tool that exists, but part of the idea of this experiment is to really kind of like explore, can Claude code do these things? In the beginning, what I was trying was the kind of interface that was presented to me, which was like a chat interface. And that's kind of the interface that's being pushed on everybody. It's like, hey, here's an AI agent, and you chat with the agent, and then you get something back out. And this model, I think, is just completely inane. I think it's not a good idea. I think it's a terrible way to use these agents. So that did not get what I would consider to be very good results. It kind of encourages you to wander around the software that you're writing and changing things kind of as you go. And that's a really kind of dangerous thing to do, especially with Claude. What I found, and I did this for like maybe like the first 4 or 5 days before I realized that I had allowed code to paint himself into a corner with the way he had designed the system. What ended up happening is that Claude would very often sort of like code a feature that would be really good, but he'd introduce a lot of bugs because he wouldn't necessarily have context on all the other things that were working in the system. And then when I'd get Claude to fix those bugs, he would just kind of ultimately like introduce more bugs, or he'd fix one bug and introduce another bug, then he'd go to fix the other bug and reintroduce the old bug from his lack of understanding. So let's cover a couple of reasons why this is the case. The first thing to understand about any sort of AI model is that it's completely stateless, and that means that you have to pass the entire context in for each new answer, question, exploration, whatever it is that you're doing. And that means that you also have to pass all the output from the model as well in this particular context. And this, of course, makes it so that if you want to design a good software feature, you're going to have multiple interactions with Claude. If you have them in one session, it's going to be very inefficient. It's going to keep, basically, the context is going to keep growing. The next problem is that the context window of a sort of session with Claude is 200,000 tokens, but when you hit that saturation, that is, you fill up the entire context, some strange things start to happen, and not necessarily in the way that you would expect them to. So if you write a source code file and you just randomly go and cut out like some middle part of the code, the chances are it's not even going to compile. But with context, what ends up happening is that you kind of get this lost in the middle problem where stuff that was established, things that were established in kind of like the middle of your conversation, just kind of seem to like disappear mysteriously. One example is I was working with Claude to create an active record generator, a very classic kind of like, I think what is his name, Nathan Fowler kind of design. So it just sort of inspects a database schema, uses that database schema to generate class files for interacting with the database with basic CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. And I did this whole interaction with Claude. Wow, he seemed to get it. He really understood stuff. Told him to go execute. He executed, created the whole system. It was actually pretty well designed with one small problem. There was no destroy action. Somehow in our conversation with create, read, update, and delete. He just completely forgot to implement delete. He forgot to implement it, forgot to test it. And it wasn't, and I, of course, didn't notice because, of course, this is a lot of code and I didn't actually sort of check it too closely. So then I went on to do the next feature was like, hey, you have to use these things. And then Claude was like, whoa, hold on a second. Your previous developer forgot to implement delete. There's no delete strategy. So do you want me to use like regular SQL? And I was like, oh, he forgot to implement delete. So it's not like the system didn't work. I mean, it was tested, it worked. He created all the different things. He has some problems with it, but we can kind of work around them. But that was an instance of the context, and that was one time where, like, by the time I got done explaining to him in one session how this whole thing worked, like, we had 1% of context left by the end. Like, this was really kind of a complicated feature for Claude to handle. So eventually I happened on the process that you kind of see up on the screen now, which I call this the kind of like Claude 4.5 development process. And I've kind of expressed it from a high level of detail here because there's a lot of specifics and you kind of have to customize a little bit to like how big the feature or how many components you have to interact with because, it's not like programming is not often just about creating one thing. It's about creating a bunch of small things and then connecting them together and then connecting those things to other things. And in order to do that effectively, you kind of have to have a certain amount of context on each kind of component. So I created this basic idea here, which is that you want to have a kind of consistent artifact inside of your context, which describes the environment that Claude is working in. And what you really don't want to happen is that you tell Claude to go do something and he says, all right, great. Now I need to spend 5 minutes figuring out how to interact with the environment in order to do the thing that I want to do. The existing way that is suggested that you do this, which I don't agree with, is creating something called a claude.md file. The problem with this is that the claude.md file becomes a garbage heap of what everyone thinks is supposed to be in Claude's context. And it may or may not apply to the task at hand. And it's very easy when you're sitting around a table talking about what applies to a software task or a software project in a human sense for you to say, well, we always need to know solid principles from Bob C. Martin. I don't agree with that, but hey, a lot of people think that solid clean code stuff is good. And that might be kind of true. But the question is does Claude need that in his context? Because there's a large chance that Claude has already been trained on that information, and so it's sort of already baked into the model. Coding standards, things like that, generally speaking, they're kind of largely baked into the model. When I use Claude, he tends to code like the surrounding code base, and his basic sort of ideas pretty much follow what I would consider to be industry standard code for the most part. Having a Claude MD that's automatically loaded into your context every time, that's automatically provided, is sneaking in information into your context that you didn't control, that you might not know about, and it's already reducing the effective context for what it is that you're going to be doing, which, by the way, like even what I would consider to be largely trivial features can easily saturate a 200,000 token context when you're really working with complex software. So you don't want any of that in there automatically. You want to decide what you're going to put in if it applies to this specific task. And so you also want to know things about like, is this a Linux system? How do I run tests? What are the general sort of like test things? And you want to get Claude to do this for you. So you're going to start by creating something called a gen env.md. That's what I call it. Explain to Claude that your purpose here is to create a markdown file to guide an AI assistant in discovering the environment it's in, how to run tests, and what tools are available to it. And you want to make this as succinct and brief as possible. And then once that rule has been created, you always want to have this refine cycle, which is once you've gotten Claude to generate this rule file that's going to guide the AI agent in discovering the system, you're going to basically clear the session, and then you're going to tell Claude, hey, Claude, I hired a developer to create this document to guide AI assistants on how to generate an env.markdown file for a particular environment and discover all these things. I want you to evaluate the file and suggest improvements that will be more effective in guiding the AI assistant. So you don't need to put too much information here because the Claude agent CLI, if that's what you're using, generally includes some information like that you're on this type of Linux system, You're in a Git repository. This is the latest branch, latest hash. And this is the current date and time. So it's only if you need to establish a few extra things like don't you use this kind of tool, or you can run this particular command, or this is how the testing workflow is set up for this particular task. So you kind of keep this really restricted. It's just like essential information. It basically serves the purpose of a Claude MD, but it's highly customized to the task that you are currently going. Not the task necessarily, but like the feature or the software thing that you're developing right now. And this is any of that sort of information that Claude always needs to know about what you're doing. So then this sort of refine loop we're going to use like all the time, which is we're going to get Claude to do something. We're going to clear the session. We're going to point it to the last work artifact that Claude did. And we're going to tell Claude that we hired somebody to do that work artifact. And now it's Claude's job to evaluate that and provide a review on it to say, what do you suggest to be changed? How can it be improved? Are there any errors? Whenever you get Claude to do anything, the very next thing you do, you clear the entire context and you say, I use this, I hired a developer, use that particular one. Never say I did it, because Claude's probably going to be a lot nicer to you. Say something like, I hired a developer to do this. I want to check their work. The next thing that you're going to create is kind of a similar thing, which is you're going to create a gen-explore MD. That's what I call it. And what this file is going to be is a guide for Claude or any kind of AI assistant. You be kind of general about it. To explore a software component like a library or something like that, and create an exploration document which lists all of the major features, the architecture, major files, major functions, with a small summary of how it might connect to other systems. You want to kind of constrain it to in that directory, so you kind of want to also add into the rules like don't stray too far, focus on the components, because again, you might end up loading like multiple of these. So the way that you use this file is that when you open up the prompt, you use @ and you load your env, because that's the one that defines the environment that you're working on. Then you're going to load @ genexplore.md. So that's the document that guides, and you're going to say, using this guide genexplore.md, we need to explore a particular software component and provide and create this document. And normally I'll have it name it as like, explore dash and then the component name or the library name. And once it's done that, and generally you also want to like instruct it to like, be asking you questions. A key component of this particular aspect is you say that you want them to be able to discuss the architecture and implementation before creating the document. So that's one of these really kind of like key phrases, because you want to trigger in Claude this kind of like this circuit where if he believes that he's going to have to interact with you on it, he's going to do a little bit more thinking. You can also use things like think hard and think harder about the particular document, especially if the software component is a bit complicated. So you might say like, load this gen-explore. We're going to explore this particular library. I want you to think hard about the implementation and architecture and how it interacts with other things, and be prepared to discuss or ask clarifying questions in order to establish a deep understanding of the particular component. And then once all of your questions have been answered, I want you to write it to genexplore-library-name.md. And that's going to be your kind of like explore file for that component, that specific component. Now we're going to do the same thing for a planning doc. And so we're going to say like, we're going to load up our env file. We don't need to load the explore in this case. Say, hey, Claude, what we want to do is create a gen plan.md. And the purpose of this is guiding an AI assistant in reading an explore document, an exploration document for context, and then querying the user for some software feature, or reading a document for some software feature, however you want to do it, because you can kind of like, these things are malleable. And the general directions that you want to give, you can be as precise or whatever as you want, but generally you say, you want to analyze the context, analyze the exploration, and analyze the environment, and come up with like, 3 to 4 high level steps. And then for each step, break the actual change necessary down to implement the feature into like, between like, 3 to 5 subtasks. And then you want to add some additional things like a required subtask for every step is that the code compiles. And then the final step must run all tests, and all tests must run and pass, and so on and so forth. Again, once you hit the end of this gen plan MD, you're going to / clear, and then you're going to have Claude evaluate it and suggest changes about how best to guide an AI assistant in creating an action plan for implementing a software feature. And then when you're done with that, you're kind of set up now to actually do this whole thing. When you start the prompt, the first thing you're going to do is you include the env. You include the exploration document, not the Gen Explorer, but the one that you created using the Gen Explorer for that particular thing. And you're going to say, with the established context in Gen Explorer, we need to make this particular change to the software. I want you to load Gen Plan and come up with a plan for making the change. And the way that you kind of like set up the plan is make sure that it kind of like establishes, the acceptance criteria, all the different information, very typical sort of software planning stuff. And then you say, and then I want you to save it to plan dash, feature name. You want to kind of get out of the session as soon as possible, run / clear, and then again at the env, at the explore file, at the gen plan, and then you want to say to Claude, hey, I had so-and-so, I had this developer create this plan and then add the plan so that it gets included. And I want you to evaluate the plan for its completeness. And do you think you can improve it to guide an AI assistant to complete this, to implement this software feature? Your next step is going to be to execute on the plan. So you're going to basically load up the env, you're going to load up the explore document, you're going to load up the plan, and then you're going to say, Claude, we've created this plan for implementing the software feature. Here's the context. Here's the plan. I want you to start executing on it. Now, here is where you kind of have to decide based on the plan whether or not you want Claude to try to implement everything in the current session. Generally, that doesn't work for anything non-trivial. Generally, you're kind of going to want to do that. So you're going to say, I want you to execute on step 1, just step 1 and its subtasks. And then when you get done, I want you to create like an artifact, okay, like some file. I want you to update the plan with the check marks saying that you've completed each one of these tasks. And at the bottom of the plan, I want you to summarize what you've done and any insights you gained during the session. And then at the end of that session, you want to clear it and we want to move to the next one. In this part of the process that we're doing, we're going to basically stop after the implementation of the first step. We're going to clear the session. We're going to load up the NV. We're going to load up the Explorer. And we're going to load up the plan. Now, if the plan is really big, maybe you don't want to have Claude write his update necessary to the plan. You might want to like just copy that stuff into a specific artifact. But generally, you want to keep your plan pretty tight too. So you want to load that up. So you load up the plan and then you say, hey, Claude, I hired a developer to perform the first step of this plan. They implemented these features, and at the bottom they put a summary of what they had done and any new insights. I want you to check their work. I want you to check their work, and I want you to suggest, did they do it completely? Were the tests implemented? Are the tests running? Are all the features present that they claim are there? And you will be surprised because very often, especially if you're working on a really complicated thing, even if it didn't seem complicated at the start, sometimes Claude can make it more complicated. The things will be missing, things won't be working, and very often in the review step, Claude will identify problems with the last work. Even if it's working and the tests are passing, a couple of things that are very common for it to find: a missing actual component, right? Everything works because Claude made it work, but like in that example that I gave where Claude was trying to do create, read, update, delete, but completely forgot to implement delete, this review process will also capture that. It's like, hey, you said to implement these 3 things, but your previous developer didn't implement this one. And the second thing is and you also want to definitely put this directive in there, is to say, evaluate the tests for how good of coverage do they actually execute all code paths. And very often, code will, and the analysis of the test will say, like, this test will always pass because you said it here and you do this here, so this test is not really testing anything. There's very often times where Claude will identify that. And so and basically you're also going to ask, say, suggest improvements, and then, oftentimes you can just in that session just say, fix these particular problems. So in that review process, he'll fix the problems, and that's usually good enough. So in this kind of last step, you can either do this with each step of the plan, which is, and sometimes is kind of necessary, especially if you've noticed that Claude was kind of struggling a little bit, like you were really kind of like saturating your context. He was really having to work because it's just a really complicated feature, and it's hard. It's very hard to break some complex features down into really, really discrete steps. So you might want to do this refactor step after every step of the plan, or you might want to go through all the steps of the plan, review all of those steps, have it go through the review cycle, and then finally at the end, once Claude say, "Hey, I've declared victory, everything's done," you want to do another review of that. Is everything done? And you want to do a refactor step where basically you're gonna load up the env, the explore, all this stuff, and then you're gonna basically say, "Hey, I hired this developer to execute this plan. He told me it's complete. I want you to review the plan for ways in which you can reduce code duplication, check tests, add additional tests to actually verify the process, ensure that the coverage is really good." And so at this point, you're generally pretty good. Even without necessarily reviewing the code, very often you want to basically make sure that the tests are running. And if you have some sort of integration or some sort of interface for your particular system, you just go to the interface and you just sort of verify that things are working. Oftentimes they won't be, and then you'll basically be getting errors. And at that point, you're going to kind of go through a few of these sort of review refactor kind of loops to sort of iron out the problems that have been introduced in this particular feature. And I generally will just like, here's the log file, this is the error that I'm getting, here's the env, here's the explore. I want you to fix these problems. You don't have to give them the plan. Like, forget about the plan now. You don't need it anymore. You can just say, these are the problems. Here's the exploration so that you can understand the system. Oftentimes, you might want to, once you've made this sort of feature, you might actually have Claude regenerate the exploration of the library so that when you're doing this sort of fixing refactoring loop, it has the most updated information about the way the code has changed. So oftentimes you like regenerate the explorer when you're done with a feature, and then you can go in and refactor. And what this ultimately gets you, very high quality code. Like I would say mid-level engineer code, not junior level engineer. Fairly complex features can be accomplished with this. And you don't have to write code and really verify it yourself because Claude will do the verification himself. So it's a very automatic process. It's a little bit futzy to do this by hand. What I'm working on right now, and what a lot of people are trying to solve, like there's this kind of movement of people saying like, "Hey, have Claude output his responses in JSON." That's obviously not the right idea. There's this new sort of encoding a library called Tune, which tries to like reduce the amount of tokens in that output. But what I think is the fundamental problem with these AI agents is that they are really organized around a chat modality. Like you're chatting with an AI. It's like this chat GPT. And I think that that is the wrong architecture for interfacing with an AI model. I think the AI agent should actually, in a certain sense, kind of like implement this process that I'm saying. So I'm working on planning out an AI agent that is a little bit geared more towards this, which is that it's about context control. It's about what's in the context at any stage, and it's about sort of as much as possible intelligently parsing the responses from Claude so that it can extract what information is in the response. That's a difficult problem to solve. It's not all that simple. Claude's output is pretty consistent. Probably the biggest use case for this particular thing is that so if you tell Claude to ask clarifying questions, he will often send those questions to you as a big blob of questions, say question one, question two, question three. And that's kind of hard for you to work through. And so you might want to, and this is what I do, which is really inefficient, but it makes it a whole lot easier, is I have them ask the questions one by one. But really, the AI agent should be the one to parse out all the questions, present them to the user one by one for the answers, collect up all the questions and answers, and then insert those into the context in the right way. And in that case, you can kind of minimize the token use and the back and forth, but you can also have a greater degree of interaction when you need to explain something through multiple questions. So I think that the current sort of model of AI model interaction, the current way that we're interacting with them, is probably not very good or efficient. It just leads to a lot of context befuddling. I call it like confuddling or context poisoning, where the context sort of becomes like there's lots of information in the context that actually isn't going to be necessary for coming to solving the problem or arriving at an answer. And we don't really currently have the ability to control the context to the degree that it really should be necessary for us to control it. And that's one of the reasons why you can kind of get bad results, because there's just too much information in the context. Compacting the context is not really the answer, because the / compact command is really kind of like this general thing. It's very general, and that's maybe not what we really want. Like, what we want is something that is more specific to the process that we're using. So possibly this could be implemented with MCP, but MCP is kind of a dumpster fire. I don't know if that's the right way to do it. I think that this kind of implementation needs to be like, you know how with writing source code we have IDEs, and IDEs are not like word processors, like a Chat GPT or like the current implementation of Claude. It's like the word processor implementation of model interaction. And we need something that's a little bit more like the IDE, which is very, very targeted towards a specific thing, which is software development, and then providing sort of tools and features that allow us to really isolate the context and isolate the important parts of the context. Whether that's through some sort of user interaction where you basically like look at all the components of it, and then you can kind of like draw like, I want to include this in the context and this in the context, and then in the next iteration only the stuff that you selected gets sent. Maybe some like question parsing where it presents the questions to you so you can answer them, and then formats them in a sort of compact way to minimize the token usage. But that's sort of like my process that I'm currently using. I've gotten pretty good results. I mean, the project that I've been working on with Claude is now at about 18,000 lines of code. It has like a whole DB layer that uses this active record pattern. It has like a services layer where it uses thrift services. The thrift services consume the DB layer, and then they respond to sort of like front end thrift based requests. And I've basically created a control panel application that allows like an admin user to like add new NPCs, add and edit players, add and edit items, display like a blueprint tree and all that kind of stuff. It's things that I've already showed you before. This development process needs refinement, and I need to work on making it a little bit easier, because obviously like doing this all manually, like create this artifact and create this artifact and do that. But until I've gone through the manual process many more times, I'm not going to know how to optimize it. And then my ultimate goal, I think, will be to try to implement my own agent code that allows you to kind of work with this and says like, all right, here's your environment context, here's your exploration contexts, and then also for you to be able to like sort of like have a listing of all the input and output, and just basically like be able to mark sections of that output as being not relevant, and so they don't get sent in the next context. So those are kind of like my general ideas that I'm going to be working on.